Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 170 of Retro Power Uncut, and unusually we start in the body prep area. So we're going to start with the Churchill two-door Coupe Mark II Jaguar project, which, as I speculated last week, is undergoing more sanding. Mark's got the next coat of polyester that I think we mentioned last week, a light overall coat of polyester spray surfacer, which is basically like a sprayable filler. We use that instead of a high build primer. It's much more stable, less prone to sinkage. So that's had another coat of that over the whole lot to try and pick up any areas where we've got quite a few areas where we were all the way through any build that we had. And the shape was pretty much there or thereabouts. So another coat of that enables everything to be blocked without any high and low spots from where we're getting thin areas of coating. Minimises the high and lows that inevitably occur where you break through the build, where you break through the polyester. So now there should be hopefully very few areas where we actually go all the way through the polyester. So I think we're on the later stages. I'm not going to count my chickens too much, but we're on the later stages of the sort of high build stages of this. The next phase really will be epoxy, but I think we're a little way away from that yet. There's a bit of work to do around all the wheel arches, swage lines, detail work in the shuts, etc, etc. But the main blocking somewhere near.
Just some detail and stuff.
Yeah. Just a lot of nitpicking. There's a lot of areas that are quite tricky on this. There's a lot of areas that have been a bit of a fight all the way through. The rear wheel arches have been quite challenging. The door shuts have been quite challenging. There's been quite a few areas where it's tested us a little bit, this one. So we kind of anticipated that would be the case, but it's been a bit of a challenge. But yeah, marching on, Mark's blocking away, and I imagine we're going to be pretty dusty and still sanding next week in here, but getting towards the latter stages of that. So that's where we're at with Churchill. In the background behind that is the Redux E30 M3, which Gary's just doing the prep work for the bond lines for the carbon panels. So he has finished all of the coatings that need to be done, and there are various coatings, but he's finished the coatings that need to be done before the panel work is bonded into place. So we have the U-Pol Raptor coatings on where we need them on, the stone chip coating basically. It's a two-pack polyurethane truck bed liner coating that we use. Bear in mind the car's a zinc metal sprayed underneath as well. That's on in all the sort of stone chip facing areas and inside the quarter panels, and then the inside is all done in a satin black finish, which is a polyurethane finish as well, and in the inside the boot area. So all of the areas that aren't accessible for paint later on are all now done. The scaffolding, so to speak, is in the car still, holding everything located correctly. The car's on its little jig trolley that holds everything in the correct places, so the scaffolding's still in, making sure everything's located correctly. So we're just getting all the panels lined up now, making sure that we've got through to clean steel on all of the bond lines, so that everything's ready, so that the carbon panels can be bonded on. So yeah, that's where we're at on that one. Brief touch on that, and then we'll wander out here to the rest of the workshop. And we've got progress on several fronts here. We've got the Allegro project. Sam's just been working on the radiator expansion tanks. We're using the Japanese style expansion tanks on these, what I would refer to as a Japanese style, where it's the radiator is completely filled with, as per what the Hondas used originally, basically. So you completely fill the radiator with coolant. There's no internal expansion space within the cooling system. Probably going to be teaching people to suck eggs here, and I may have said about it on a previous episode, can't remember now. But you have to remember, water has a coefficient of expansion. The reason cars have a header tank or an expansion tank on top of the radiator is because water expands when it gets hot. No surprises there. If you fill the cooling system completely with water, it will expand and have to get out somewhere. So what you can either do is leave some airspace within the cooling system for that coolant to expand into, or do what the Japanese tend to do, which is fill the cooling system completely full of water, and then have a radiator cap that allows as the water expands, it expands out through the pressure relief cap, down a pipe that leads into the bottom of an external reservoir that isn't pressurised, So as the coolant expands, it goes down that pipe and fills up that secondary reservoir, and then as the cooling system cools back down and the water contracts again, it then draws that coolant back through the pressure cap. As it cools down, it sucks that coolant back up. That's the system we're using on these for no great reason other than that's how Honda did it, and it does actually help us out in that if you have an integral header tank in the system, it has to be higher, it has to be the highest point of the system, so the air naturally makes its way to that point. And if we do that, it just creates some other problems for us in the engine bay. So we're going with the Honda system, and the original Honda tank doesn't really fit anywhere sensible, and we can't get it new. So Sam's fabricated some aluminium tanks to do that job, and he's just sorting the bracketry out for that car. He couldn't do that before because it had the rotisserie mounts on it, so he's just removed them while he does the bracketry for that, and then the rotisserie mounts will go back on. And to that end, that car this afternoon will be coming off the jig, going onto the rotisserie, so we can start the underside work on that one. Bobby has also been working on the doors for car number 2, the brown car. Yes, we haven't got the doors for this car here at the moment. They're at KS Composites at the moment. He's been working on the doors for the brown car, the second car, fitting the central locking actuators into the doors on that, making the provisions for those. And he's also just finished off doing the provision for the wiring conduits that go from the A-pillars into the actual doors themselves, so we've got somewhere to run the wiring through. He's also been doing the, continuing what we touched on last week, continued with the mountings in the footwells for the twin PDUs and the ECU. I think the ECU was actually done last week, but he's finished the mountings for the 2 PDUs. We're using 2 ECU Master 16-channel PDUs and 1 ECU Master engine ECU. The twin PDUs are both CAN bus linked, so they're controlled through the CAN network on the car. Both have a main power feed to them, and then and all their outputs, and then just a CAN feed to tell them what to do. So he's got those mounted in the footwell, and then built the kick plate, cover plate, which will cover them up, keep them nice and tucked out of harm's way, and also form like the footrest underneath the carpet. That's all been done. That's in aluminium. That's a pretty strong sort of nice footrest area in the passenger footwell. So that's all done. So I think that's pretty much where we're at on that. And then, as I say, this one's going to be coming off the... he's just been doing a last thing. He's just had one of the actual final fitment wheels on the car just to check for clearance on the washer, on the screen wash tank, because it's quite tight on the wheel on lock. But it's actually plenty. There's over 30, I think about 35 millimetres of clearance, so plenty enough clearance for what we need there. So yeah, that's all looking really good. Really happy. That's coming off the jig. We can get all the underside work done. There's quite a lot of grotty metal work underneath on that from where the floor pan modifications were made. Obviously underneath nothing's been dressed because it's on the jig, it's not accessible. The welds were done from the top, so the central chassis rails where they were modified, they've been welded from the inside of the car, but they need to be finished on the underside of the car, and that can't be done yet. Once that's off onto the rotisserie, we can do all that underside finishing, so that's all, that'll all be nice to get buttoned up, and that'll be pretty much, that body shell will be then pretty much as complete as it can be until we get the carbon panels. To that end, things are progressing well at KS. The books are finished, and I believe probably this week, next week, the moulds are being made. So we're looking somewhere near end of the month, I believe, end of this month, early next month, for final carbon parts for the quarter panels and wings, at which point we can actually then finish the complete fabrication on both of these cars. At that point we can actually finish the metalwork, so really exciting point to be at, so we want to get that done. The other detail point actually I'll mention in the background, no work at the moment, the other thing we're waiting for is the one of the carbon airboxes. I've ordered that from Reverie Components. There's an ITG filter inside a carbon airbox that's going on over the throttle bodies, and we need that to sort out the positioning of the electro-hydraulic power steering pump, because that's going to sit just around underneath the end of the airbox above the steering rack. So we've got to finalise that. I've mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. We've got to finalise the positioning of that. We can't do that till we've got the airbox. That should be here today or tomorrow, actually, I believe, all being well. So yeah, that's where we're at with that lot. All good progress, really. Another thing I'll mention, actually, while we're stood here, is I had a visit yesterday from a chap by the name of Stuart Bearcroft from Goodflex Rubber Company. who have helped us out recently. I say helped us out, we bought some things from them, but they've been very, very helpful on the escort projects next door. Not really a metalwork issue, not something that's relevant to what we're doing here at the moment, but it's just in my mind, so I'll mention it. An area that we have had many problems with is the permeation of fuel vapour through fuel hoses, particularly fuel filler hoses, causing a smell inside vehicles, and generally fuel hoses not being of a sufficient standard to withstand modern fuels with high ethanol content. And finally, after searching around and around and going to all sorts of sources that I thought should know how to solve that problem, we finally found a company that could solve that problem, and that was Good Flex Rubber, who supplied us with FKM line fuel hose. And it's made incredibly well, and it has absolutely no fuel vapour permeation with modern fuels. And we're really happy with that. And it was a custom-made hose at a very reasonable price, made to order in a very quick time. So Good Flex Rubber, very, very good supplier, very, very helpful. Now, Stuart coming over was beneficial to both of us. He wanted to have a little look round here, which was really nice. It was really good to see him, nice to have a chat. But actually, it had a secondary benefit to us and hopefully them as well, which is while he was here, he mentioned, I asked him about custom-made 1, 2, maybe 3 off coolant hose sets. Now, I'm aware of how they're made, we've dealt with this before, and I was talking to him about how we could go about making mandrels for them. Stainless steel tube mandrels I've done before, talking to him about the nuances of making mandrels for custom hose sets. And at that point, he mentioned why not 3D print them? And it turns out that Good Flex have the capacity to 3D print mandrels that will withstand multiple trips through their hose autoclave or hose oven, depending on how they're curing those hoses. And that's really good news, because it means that potentially going forward we can make 1 and 2 off flexible coolant hose sets for our vehicle builds. Now, I'm looking at an Allegro here. It won't actually really help us on this, because we're actually going to be able to use a standard off-the-shelf Honda hose set on this, because all the hoses, bar 2 slight shortenings, are just Honda hoses here. So that's a bad example, but going forward that could be a really useful process for us. And I thought I'd mention it because a lot of people wouldn't be aware of the possibilities there, because I certainly wasn't aware that there was a 3D printable material, or readily 3D printable material, that was even reasonably affordable, that would withstand 300 degrees-ish in an autoclave. Or I don't think the cure temperature is quite that high, but between 200 and 300 degrees C in an autoclave. So that's really good news, really helpful for us, and hopefully that's something we'll be able to do on some of our builds going forward, because it really will make for a really neat solution. At the moment we tend to try and use straight sections of hose and quite a lot of aluminium fabrication to work out 1 and 2 off sort of coolant systems. But if we can use 3D printed mandrels and make probably 1 hose set plus a couple of spares for a project car, then that's a really neat solution. It gives the customer spare parts for the future. We've got the parts to fit to the car, and it all looks like an OEM, original manufacturer part. Really good. So yeah, that was a very beneficial visit for both of us, I think. Moving on from there, we're going to go over to have a little look at the Interceptor. And there's a bit of work going on this on several fronts. We have the bonnet. We'll start at the bonnet. Just in the foreground here is Matt, who is doing a trial with us at the moment. He's doing a bit of a trial with us this week, and he has set 2 on the bonnet, and we had a little look at the bonnet on Monday, and the conclusion was that it needs reskinning. Despite being brand new, it needs reskinning. There is a similar problem to the problem we have with the doors, in that the way the outer skin has been fixed to the inner skin at production has caused us defects in the panel that we can't remove due to the frame blocking access. So Matt's de-skinned the bonnet and got that all ready to reskin, so we're just waiting for a new skin for that now so that we can reskin that. Same process happening with the doors. We mentioned that last week. Tom's cracked on with this near side door. Been a few ups and downs on that, a few difficulties. The door skins were a little bit short for the aperture, so we've had to do quite a bit of rework in lengthening the skins slightly to get them to better fit the aperture. And there's been a few traumas with certain other areas on those skins not being a perfect fit, but we're getting close now, I think, to having it somewhere near fitting the aperture. In the meantime, Matt's been working on the front end, getting various deficiencies out of the panel work, shall we say. There's a few dents in the panels that needed taking out, and then there's some weld finishing around the front valance where the valance is welded to the wings, or welded to the front panel. I'm not sure it's the wing or the front panel, but where there's weld lines on that front panel, there was quite a bit of waviness. There's a fair bit of waviness in the panel there, and that needed taking out. And then also the swage line, this swage line that runs around here. Sorry, Matt, poking in your face. That's the swage line that runs around the front there. Again, where the joins were made, that was quite wavy, and there was a bit of waviness in that step. So Matt's done a very nice job of chasing that as much as he possibly can to try and straighten that swage line out. He's got that pretty close, but there's not really enough material to play with to get it perfect. So he's finalised that with some lead just to get that nicely tidied up. There was also a bit of a sort of a dog leg kick in the wheel arch, both sides, where the wing was joined to the valance. So he's got that out, he's pulled that out and hammer and dollied that out as much as possible, and then he's tidying up the outside face with lead, foiling and a little bit of panel beating just to get all that right, and then he's going to cut the lead in around the wheel arch and tidy that lot up. And so then it's really, we've got to wait for the bonnet skin before we can really do the lead work around the bonnet aperture. That's where we're at on the front end. In parallel with that, Stu's been working on the tailgate. I'll stand over here to keep making Jamie's life a bit easier. Stu's been working on the tailgate at the back. Originally, the tailgate was lifted by a set of springs that I've got a bit of a farming background, and the springs remind me of the old lift springs on a Massey Ferguson 30 seed drill, I think. But, they look like they ought to be on a piece of farm machinery, not on the tailgate of a car. So we've decided to not use those and put gas springs on it. Of course, a slight complication on that is not knowing what pressure of gas spring we need. So Stu's done a bit of engineering on the back, and basically jury-rigged a bit of a setup on the back to enable us to do a pull test. We've actually pull tested it to our steel rack because that's bolted down. So we did a pull test with a crane scale on there just to measure the force required to open that tailgate throughout its arc and work out where the force was highest and what force was required. So we've done that, and at that point Stu's been able to spec some gas struts and some nitrogen springs that will lift that tailgate correctly, hopefully. We've got a first one, you know, there can be some fine tuning if needs be, but we've got an initial spec for the gas springs that are needed to open the boot, and he's now making the mounts for the gas springs that go under the tailgate, which is surprisingly flimsy with no glass in it. The glass is more structurally important on that than the steel work, to be honest. But he's making some framework to take the gas springs on the frame, on the tailgate frame, and then some mountings that go into onto the top of the rear wheel arches inside the boot for the opposite end of those springs, so that we've got that problem solved. And then he's also finished the battery tray. He's made the battery tray and the battery tray mounts in the back for a pretty big battery. We tend to go on most of our daily driver stroke regular use type vehicles rather than motorsport track day leaning type vehicles. We tend to go for a big lead acid old fashioned battery. They're just big, old, dependable. Yes, they're heavy, yes, there are downsides, but they just do the job and work, and they start your car when you need it to. There's no fancy lightweight stuff going on. We tend to stick with the good old-fashioned technology. It's more reliable on a car that you just want to work every day. For track days, obviously, we put a bit more thought into lightweight batteries, much more modern stuff, but they are harder work. They need more attention. They're not as foolproof as a good old-fashioned lead-acid battery. So that's what we stick to. So we've got a big, I can't actually remember which model it is, but a big lead-acid battery in the back of this, because it's going to have, there's quite a lot of battery demand on a vehicle like this. So we've just made sure that we're not cutting ourselves short in terms of battery capacity. So that's what Stu's been on with, and he's pretty much getting there, I think now. I think the tailgate stuff's about there. The battery mountings are about there. So yeah, progressing well on several fronts simultaneously on this, which is what we're aiming to do. And then, yeah, we've got some more projects coming in, which will be, we were kind of hoping one of them would be here, but there's a bit of a space still at the moment, as you can see, so it's not turned up. There's been a bit of a transport issue on getting one of them here, so I'm not going to say anything about it because it's not here yet, so we'll break that news when it arrives. And there's another project in the background, which will also be interesting when it rolls up. it actually ties into something lying around in this workshop that has probably been out of shot in most of this video, but it ties in quite nicely to something we've got lying around the workshop. I'll drop that hint and see if anybody can guess what it is. But yeah, there's another very exciting project waiting in the wings to announce. Again, we'll hold fire until it actually is here. But yeah, I'm really disproportionately excited about these upcoming things. So that's really good news. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I was going to cover. We're also going to have a bit of a reveal on, I think I mentioned a while back about a new bit of machinery in the workshop. We're not going to cover it today because we're perilously close to actually having it sort of installed and looking a bit more reasonable. It's been in a bit of a state for the last few weeks just because of trying to move lots of things around and tidy the place up and do some construction work and various other things. But I think by next week we should have it in a more photogenic state. So I think we'll perhaps do a reveal on a new bit of machinery next week as well. So at that point, I think it's time to hand over to Cal in the assembly shop. So I shall see you all next week.
Thank you, Nat. I'm probably going to start by mentioning the fact that there is an absentee in the workshop in the form of the Land Cruiser. So this weekend just gone, I took it down, I would say bright and early, but it was very dark and early, to Bicester Heritage for the first Sunday scramble of the year. We had it parked up on the Heritage Skills Academy stand down there. So if anybody saw it, I hope you enjoyed looking at it. I didn't spend much time with it, I have to say. Initially when I turned up, it was absolutely freezing cold, and I spent most of my time walking around trying to keep warm, clutching a warm drink. And then my family turned up, so I was trying to keep my kids from going insane by walking around and looking at various other cars. But the culmination of taking it down there was actually handing it over to the owner. So I drove it down there, he joined me later on in the day and then drove it home and actually has been using it as his daily car ever since. And so far, so good, feedback's been positive, so hopefully that will continue and you might see it on the streets of London if you live down that way. Moving on from that, Camaro. So actually one thing I've been doing this week is having a massive clear up on the shelves. We've got to that stage. We often get to these two are probably at the same stage, the two Escorts, where we have an enormous amount of parts on the shelves upstairs and you suddenly realise that there's not much left to go on the car and you start going through the shelves thinking, well, yeah, all of this stuff is old stuff that we're not using or, you know, temporary parts or whatever. And so I decided the time was ripe to have a massive clear out on the shelves upstairs, consolidate everything down, and suddenly it seems a bit more manageable. Every time you go up there to get a pass, there's only a handful of things up there. And that kind of triggered a few remaining jobs that are on the cards for this. So we're chipping into some of them and carrying on with some of the ones we were already on with. So Sam's been on with the fabrication of the screen wash and coolant expansion tanks, which I think I mentioned last week. Probably showed some footage of them in the early stages last week. He's finished them this week. And then Gaz has now painted those with a satin black polyurethane paint that we've used on various things on this car. In that batch he also did a few other things, so the seat mounting adapters, if you like, the big mounting plates that are in the car, they've been in there for a while just in a bare metal state from when we mocked up, but he's now painted them. Also the battery tray that Anthony was mounting last week, that's been painted black so it looks a bit more discreet. That's now in for the final time on this. And then we were just having a look at audio system as one of the next ports of call on it. So we're going to do some speakers in the kick panels. So originally there's air ventilation through the kick panels, but with the aircon system we're running in this now, I don't think there's going to be too many problems with misting up inside. So we're going to get rid of the footwell air intakes, and in their place will be mounted some speakers. Luke's just about to make a start on designing an adaptation to the kick panel trim. So I think we're going to use part of the original kick panel because it has this long section that comes up the door shut and finishes it, which would be difficult to make in any other way, or certainly not particularly economical to make our own. But he's going to make an adapter that goes on there, which we can mount a speaker grill into that will just finish off the kick panel nicely. So speakers going in there. There's also 6x9s going in the back shelf, which I think Anthony's actually working on the parcel shelf right now. So we're binning the old sort of pressed fibreboard parcel shelf, cutting out a new one of those in 3mm ABS, and he's just cutting the speaker holes into that now. And then one of the next things we're going to do is the amplifier mounting. So we're going to be mounting, it's actually the same Audison amp I think as we've used in the Escorts. It's quite a nice setup, very compact multi-channel amplifier that we can use the Audison Bluetooth receiver with it, which plugs in via a little optical cable, and then the controller that goes with a little rotary volume controller, which will be run via a long cable, which actually ties in slightly with the Escorts. And I think Adam yesterday or today has just run the cable down the sill on the Escort for the audio controller on that, because we've designed a centre console on those that integrates that little rotary volume controller. And actually it's the same on this, although we haven't made the final console. We've CAD'd it up and we've done a 3D printed prototype of the centre console fascia, which integrates that volume control at the back. So getting that Audison gear in is going to be one of the next things. And upholstery, so Dean is on right now with upholstering the Recaros for this, and they're in a really nice brown leather, so I'm looking forward to seeing those. And then I think the next step is going to be going through some of the interior design. If you followed us for a long while, this car was not necessarily planned exactly to be like this from the very start. The sort of project evolved a little bit as we went along, and the door card design, we never went over it really. We were focusing on the metalwork. We've been focusing on small chunks because it's been a little bit of an on and off project, and we've kind of got our head around what we're doing with the seats. But the door cards, which are just black vinyl, and I think they're new reproduction ones that were in it when we got it, do look fairly respectable. But I had a quick chat with the owner yesterday, and I think he's in the mood for finishing them off to the same standard as everything else. So I think we're going to move on to a little bit of interior design work on the door cards on this next. But in general, it is getting there. I think really, once Dean's progressed with the seats, we can get all those in. Carpets, actually, I should have mentioned, Anthony was offering up the carpets this week. They're the ones that came in it, and they are, again, they're new reproduction ones. They are in very good condition. We were wondering whether they would fit or not, because we've got a larger transmission tunnel for the Tremec manual box that's in it. But actually, because we're running the centre console at the front, we can split the front carpet, and although the tunnel is a bit bigger, we can split it down the middle, and it just leaves a small gap in the middle, which will be covered by the console anyway. So that's worked out quite nicely. And other than that, it all fits in there and all looks nice and clean and undamaged. So we're just going to go with the carpets that were already in it. So that's where we're at with that. And moving over this way, there's some sort of Jag subframe bomb has gone off in this area. Jim has been very busy continuing with preparing all of these components. So obviously he's taken that complete rear subframe assembly that we had and the front cross member. So this is the custom front cross member we did for it. This is the Detroit Speed steering rack that we've used. And then all of the peripheral components of that have now been disassembled into all their individual parts, and the same with the rear end. So these are the drive shafts, for example, with the UJs disassembled, so the bearings are out of those, and we're down to just the core components, ready to go for blasting, zinc metal spraying and powder coating. And the same applies to everything. So everything's in individual parts, but also then masked. So for instance, if I pick out this, which is half of one of the lower wishbone arrangements, so these Jag lower wishbones are basically two parts bolted together with the ball joint sandwiched here and then tied together with the lower spring pan. So as you can see, the bores where the bushes fit, we've just cut pieces of silicon tube which go in there. Same on here, and the any threaded holes have got sacrificial bolts wound into them, because these will be the original bolts, but we'll be doing new bolts for it, so we'll just use these as sacrificial ones. So once this is powder coated, we can just wind them back out and the threads are nice and clean. And that kind of extends throughout. So if you look at this cross member as well, same deal, silicon tube inside here, same here. It works really well for media blasting and powder coating, because the silicon withstands the heat of the powder coat bake cycle, so it doesn't just melt down to nothing, but it also is soft enough that the sand blasting that's done to it first just bounces off. So it's quite a nice way of doing it, and they just pull straight out again afterwards. So yeah, we're looking pretty good. So we've basically got a load of stuff here ready to go for blast, zinc metal spray, powder coat. This box here it's all smaller fasteners that are going to be bead blasted and zinc nickel plated. And then we're left with the differential. Now that's going to go away to Simply Performance, who are going to rebuild that with all new bearings, etc. We'll have a look at the crown wheel and pinion, look at the condition of that, and decide whether to replace that with new, depending on the what level of wear we see in that. It's an old S-type diff, so I'm not holding out chances of it being good in terms of the condition of the crown wheel and pinion, but when they've worked their magic on that, that will come back to us as essentially a new unit. So yeah, we get all this stuff away, and we will have all of the ingredients to build our finished subframes when that comes back. Moving on from that, I think probably what's worth mentioning next is what's going on in the CAD layout upstairs, which is again carrying on in the same twofold nature. I might just move over here, make Jamie trip over all those boxes. It's the same sort of twofold nature as we have done for the last few weeks, so Quattro and E-type, and Luke's been pressing on with the E-type. We kind of got to the point where the main console and dash structure, which we're hoping to do as one composite moulding, we've got 90% there now, to the point where I could send that model to KS Composites so they could estimate me to make the tooling and make the parts for that. Next step on that before I actually pull the trigger is I want to have some sort of real world visualization of the shape and space that that takes up. So what we're doing is Luke has basically plasma cut a load of cross-sections of the console and the main dash, and we're going to tack them all in situ in the car to give us the actual outline of the structure. And then we're going to create, just crudely in cardboard and paper, basically all the fascia panelling around that to give us an idea of the space it takes up. And we can get the seats back in the car. Owner can come down, he can sit in it, and we can make sure that everything kind of falls to hand how you want it to feel. Everything takes the space up that you expect. It doesn't feel too cramped, etc. So that's the next step there before we actually bite the bullet and get the tooling made to make the main parts. And then he's moved on to door card structure. So we're trying to design it such that the glossy dash fascia actually curves round and flows into the door card. And then it's working on from there how we create the look we want on the door card, and they're tiny. That's the strange thing. I keep having to say this, not only to the guys up there, to myself and to the client, that the E-type interior is probably half the size you envisage it is when you actually look at these CAD renders. You imagine, yeah, we'll just put that vent here, we'll put that switch there, and you sort of forget that everything is literally half the size you think it is. So when you kind of look at the car, it recalibrates your brain, and you think, oh yeah, okay. And the door cards are literally only like that high, and not particularly long either. So you sort of start to gravitate towards these grand ideas of how you would lay everything out, and then when you actually sort of lay it on the real door card in real life, you think, yeah, okay, we'll rein those ideas in a bit. But at the minute, we're thinking about doing quite a long longitudinal armrest at the bottom that curves up a little at the back, tapering that glossy fascia onto the door card, but sort of tapering it out quite quickly so it doesn't flow all the way to the back of the card. And then we'll have some buttons probably at the front of the armrest, because we're going to have electric windows on this. Now we could do repurposed cranks, which actually is what I'm doing on the Camaro. We're going to have the window cranks repurposed as switches for the windows, but I think on the E-type we'll do them as actual switches. And then also a switch for the opening and closing of the door, because as it stands at the minute, our plan is to have electrically opening and closing doors on it with electric soft close latches. And we've also done a modification. I don't know if I showed this at the time, but we've done a modification whereby we've altered the hinge pin angle on a redesigned hinge we're doing, so that as the doors open, they open in the normal direction, but they actually angle up as they open. So it should be quite a nice party piece that you can basically press a button, the door will open up at an angle. And again, I hope this all works out as we're planning, but the intention is we're going to have basically a sensor pad in the door that detects the proximity of anything outside the door. So if you press the button to open the door and it's going to open into something, it stops short of opening into something and avoids damaging it. So fingers crossed we can get all that to work. We'll have the trial components to see if we can make that work over the coming weeks. And then in the meantime, George has been on with the Quattro. So again, it's really just moving forward, refining all the shapes. It's kind of incremental changes again. So I go up there, we both sort of look at where we've got to with it, discuss, you know, proportions of things. So we were bringing the rear bumper in slightly snugger, changing the shape where the side of there's like a sort of zigzag shape at the side of the bumper, trying to make that look more intentional rather than just look like a crack in the bumper. So we were like bringing that out, making it more three-dimensional, so the upper part is proud of the lower part sweeps around sort of more tight to the body. And it's just basically going through that process repeatedly of trying ideas, seeing if they look right. You know, it's a difficult one because we're taking quite an iconic looking car, and we want it to unmistakably look like a Quattro, but also add a very obvious kind of modern edge to it. And I say a modern edge, we're kind of taking that kind of retro modern thing, a bit like you've seen in that Hyundai concept car of late. But the inclination is to sort of subtle everything down, tone things down too much. You know, you sort of start to think, oh, it's a bit out there, it's a bit blocky, it's a bit this, it's a bit that. And your tendency is to sort of water it down. And then as you start to water things down, you lose. It just looks like a slightly changed Quattro rather than a completely different take on it. So it's very difficult. It's difficult for me to articulate this. Me and George kind of put heads together and think in a very similar way about it. But it's very difficult kind of modernising a classic design like that. So it's unmistakably what it was, but quite clearly a new take on it. On that note, I'm going to grab my phone because there was a couple of questions. And I knew this week we were running a little bit short on content, which is why I'm waffling on a lot. But I'm going to grab a couple of questions that I saw. So, first one, the username is thetimper923. I'm waiting for the day somebody uses something offensive as their username, and I don't realise until I've read it out. Where is that washer fluid reservoir fill hose port sourced from? Could utilise the same style in my own project, Restomod Cosy. Now I'm assuming you're talking about the Allegro, and actually this is a company I've only recently found out about. I don't know quite how to pronounce it. I always call them Doggo, which makes it sound like I'm talking about something that might come out of a dog. But DOGA, it's a Spanish company. They do various car components, but one of the things they do is washer fluid systems, and they do a great range of washer bottles of all sorts of different shapes and sizes, with integrated pumps in a lot of occasions. Interestingly, some of them come with pumps that have a Deutsch DT connector socket on, which is very nice that it's got a decent quality socket, because most of the universal ones have some crummy little spade connection on. And they also do a screw-on flexible necks of all sorts of different lengths, from kind of massive to incredibly short. And they also do various jets. They do on wiper arm jets, which is also a very interesting thing, which we're employing on a few cars coming up. So they fit onto your standard kind of rectangular profile classic wiper arm and mount the jet on the arm. Now we've done quite a few before that have like a long spray bar on the arm, but it was an interesting discovery. So yes, good question, and there's your answer. Where else are we? Doc Dave 428 said, could you have the air vents in the dash? This is talking about the Project Norman E-Type, but they disappear much like the screen does. Funnily enough, we did talk about exactly that. The F-Type Jag has something quite similar. It's got rectangular vents in the middle of the dash that just pop up when they're required. We did think about this. Our concern is the amount of space. It's going back to what I was saying a minute ago about there being very limited space in an E-Type. Everything's smaller than you think. So actually the mechanism to do that, when we've already got the screen just in that general area and then all the air ducting that's going to go in behind there, probably means there's not room to do that. This was Phil Tucker 1224. I feel like I've seen that name quite a few times. Can actual 3D printed dashboard vent parts be leather upholstered directly, or do they need to be created in carbon fibre or fiberglass? Yeah, they can be, as long as they're in a heat resistant material. We've done that quite a few times. That's one of the really good uses for 3D printers. Upholstered parts, we can make them as the final part. Obviously we can prototype them, but then we can use that as the final part, wrap it in leather. So yes, if we were going to do that dash design we talked about, where we've got the dash top with a separate insert in it that's the air vent pod, then yes, that will be a 3D printed final part. And then the last one I'll go with is Phil P says, will you paint the Jag engine block? It would be a shame for that lovely fresh finish to corrode and end up looking shabby. No, we won't. I love that, and I think Nat would say the same. I love that sort of fresh aluminium casting look. It's conveniently next to me. You can see it on the throttle bodies on this and on the water rail. And yes, although admittedly it does corrode over time, painted finishes on aluminium castings can sometimes look a lot worse. I've seen a lot of people just go silver paint this kind of thing, and ultimately it always ends up getting damaged, and then you get corrosion creeping underneath the paint, and that looks 10 times worse when you've got flaking off bits of silver paint on there. And the beauty of the bead blasting, which is why we've done that rather than any kind of grit blasting or sand blasting on it, is that it kind of peens the surface of the metal. So rather than leaving it with a lot of kind of open pores, which you'd get if you grit blasted it, which tends to be the source of immediate corrosion when you get moisture on there, that kind of peened finish you get from round glass bead actually is quite resistant. It kind of closes the pores of the casting and means it's as resistant to corrosion as an original casting would have been. So no, we won't be painting the block. It will corrode over time as an original block would have done when fitted in the Jag that it came in. But to me, that's the better look on an engine like that, is that kind of OEM look. And on that note, I am going to leave you and I'll see you next week.